Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Burns Guide. Today we'll be looking at the incendiary political poem, The Tree of Liberty. It is important to note that while this poem is widely attributed to Burns, there is no conclusive evidence that he wrote it. The stance of the poem with regards to revolutionary France would have been seen as seditious in its time in Britain. If Burns was the author or the editor of the text, he was wise to remain anonymous in its circulation. Heard ye the tree of France? I wotna what's the name o' it. Around the tree the patriots dance, while Europe kens the fame o' it. It stands where aince the Bastille stood, a prison built by kings, man, when superstition's hellish brood kept France in leading strings, man. Upo this tree there grows sick fruit, its virtues all can tell, man. It raises man aboon the brute, it maks him ken himsel', man. If aince the peasant taste a bit, he's greater than a lord, man, and with a beggar shares a mite o' all he can afford, man. This fruit is worth all Afric's wealth, to comfort us 'twas sent, man, to gie the sweetest blush o' health, and mak us all content, man. It clears the een, it cheers the hurt, maks high and law good friends, man, and he wha acts the traitor's pert, it to perdition sends, man. My blessings I attend the chiel, wha pitied Gallia's slaves, man, and staw a branch, spite o' the deal frae ont the western waves, man. Fair virtue, watered it wi' care, and now she sees wi' pride, man, how weel it buds and blossoms there, its branches spreading wide, man. But vicious folk I hate to see the works of virtue thrive, man. The courtly vermin ban the tree, and grat to see it thrive, man. King Louis thocht to cut it doon when it was unca sma', man. For this the watchman cracked his croon, cut off his heed and all, man. A wicked cruise ain on a time did tak a solemn aith, man. It ne'er should flourish to its prime at what they pledged their faith, man. Away they gaed wi' mock parade, like beagles hunting game, man, but soon grew weary o' the trade and wished they'd been at hame, man. For freedom, standing by the tree, her sons did loudly call, man. She sang a sang o' liberty that pleased the main and all, man. By her inspired, the newborn race soon drew the avenging steel, man. The hirelings ran, her foes gied chase, and banged the despot wheel, man. Let Britain boast her hardy oak, her poplar and her pine, man. Old Britain aince could crack a joke and o'er her neighbours shine, man. But seek the forest, round, and soon 'twill be agreed, man, that sic a tree cannot be found twixt London and the Tweed, man. Without this tree, alake, this life is but a vale of woe, man. A scene of sorrow mixed with strife, nae real joys we know, man. We labour soon, we labour late, to feed the titled knave, man, and all the comfort we're to get is that ayont the grave, man. With plenty of sick trees I trow the world would live in peace, man. The sword would help to mak a plough, the din of war would cease, man. Like brethren in a common cause we'd on each other smile, man, and equal rights and equal laws would gladden every isle, man. Whae worth the loon, wha wadna eat sic halesome dainty cheer, man. I'd gie the shoon frae off my feet to taste sic fruit, I swear, man. Syne let us pray, auld England may sure plant this far-famed tree, and blithe we'll sing, and hail the day that gave us liberty, man. The poem is set to the Killiecrankie measure, a popular Jacobite song from the 17th century. It has 4 metrical feet and uses an A-B-A-B, C-D-C-D rhyming scheme. The poem starts with a rhetorical question, immediately and directly addressing the reader in a familiar tone, like a friendly stranger striking up a conversation. Heard ye the tree of France? The narrator fails to recall its name, however we are told it is famous throughout Europe. Contemporary readers would have needed no prompting to understand the reference to the French Revolution. Already the sprinkling of Scots in the poem and the conversational tone of the piece informs us that this is the voice of the people, speaking to the people. We are told that patriots dance around the tree. It stands on the site of the Bastille, no arbitrary site. This was the state prison used by French kings and a common symbol of oppression. The narrator describes this bygone time by evoking an image of the French nation tied to leading strings. Leading strings were straps that would be attached to a toddler when learning to walk. It was intended to make sure the child never strayed too far. This is, of course, a powerful metaphor to convey the idea of a nation trying to find its feet, but being reined in by the hellish brood of superstition. Now, in contrast, we are told there grows a tree which gives off fruit that raises man aboon the brute, above mere brutes. It makes him ken or know himself. From what we are told, it seems to create paradise on earth. There is here, of course, a religious allusion to the tree of life in Genesis in the Bible. In the second verse, we see an idea very common in Burns's poetry, a challenging of perceived notions of rank or class. When he tastes this fruit, a peasant can be greater than a lord. After eating the fruits of this tree, he is willing to share a portion of his meagre lot with a beggar. The narrator tells us of the great value of the fruit, greater than the wealth of Africa. It gives health, contentment, clears the een and cheers the heart, clears the eye to make us see clearly and uplifts our spirits. It makes us see beyond status and sends traitors to hell. The narrator's blessings lie with the chiel, or person who pitied Gallia's slaves. Gallia, the Latin name for Gaul, in other words, France. A branch was stolen from beyond the western waves, from the revolutionaries in the United States of America, and watered with care by fair virtue. Virtue, personified, is proud that the tree is blossoming in France. Now the narrator turns his attention to King Louis XVI of France and his court, who hate to see virtuous works thrive. The language used is deliberately degrading. They are merely folk who are vicious and vermin, who grat or cried, seeing the tree growing, and sought to have it cut down, only for King Louis to have his own crown cracked and his head chopped off. In the next verse, the narrator paints the image of a hunting party going out like beagles. The internal rhyme and repetition of the A sound in "Away they gaed we mock parade" helps to create the idea of the party galloping out, but this is only a pretense, and very soon they all wish they had stayed at home, because in the next verse, freedom makes her triumphant appearance. She sings of liberty to please and inspire her sons. We see the once pompous parade now cowardly running away, the despot finally banged in the final line of the stanza. The poem, having detailed the initial stages of the French Revolution, now boldly turns its glance homeward. Let Britain boast her hardy oak, poplar and pine. Britain thinks itself great and virtuous, yet we as readers already know of the inferiority of its trees compared with this sublime tree of France, the tree of liberty, watered by virtue and guarded by freedom, with fruits worth the wealth of Africa. Such trees, we are told, cannot be found between London and the River Tweed. The Tweed flows through the Scottish borders and can be seen as a natural border between Scotland and England. Perhaps the narrator, in his Scots tongue, is suggesting that a sapling of such a tree might be found in Scotland. The narrator tells us that life without this tree is joyless and sorrowful. He uses the pronoun we when he tells us we labour soon, we labour late. The narrator repeats the idea again in all the comfort we're to get. He makes himself one with the proletariat. Once again, this poem speaks in the voice of the people. And what does all their labour achieve, he asks? It feeds knaves, solely because they bear titles. This is a rallying call for revolution, or at the very least, reform in Britain. We are now told to imagine forests of these trees of liberty. The world would live in peace, the sword would make a plough, and war would end. Humankind would be like brothers with equal rights and laws. This is a clear piece of political propaganda. The sentiments expressed, the ideals of revolutionary France, can be found in other Burns poems, such as "A man's a man for all that," "Liberté, égalité, fraternité." In the final stanza, the poem remarks that loons, or rogues, who wouldn't eat the tree's fruit, are wayward, worthy of woe or sorrow. He would happily give up his shoes to taste it. The narrator concludes that we must pray that England, not Britain as before, will plant this tree, and we'll blithely sing and hail our liberty. On August 14th, 1765, a group of political activists met beneath a stately elm tree in Boston. They called it the Liberty Tree, and they were the Sons of Liberty. They were meeting to protest the new stamp tax on printed goods imposed on the American colonies by the British state. This was one of the first rumblings of the American Revolution, as they called for no taxation without representation. The Liberty Tree went on to become a powerful symbol of the Revolution. English-born radical and revolutionary Thomas Paine sang his praises of the Liberty Tree in this poem, published in 1775, just 2 years before the United States of America declared its independence. Its parallels with the Scots poem, The Tree of Liberty, are striking. Thomas Paine went on to publish one of the most groundbreaking works of the 18th century in 1791, The Rights of Man. It was a political manifesto that was so visionary, many of its concepts weren't enacted in the United Kingdom until the mid-20th century. Indeed, some of its concepts still haven't. The Rights of Man opposed hereditary titles, advocated subsidised education and lower taxes for the poor, and advocated a progressive income tax, whereby tax incrementally increased the more you earn. The book was published in response to and in support of the French Revolution. The storming of the Bastille in Paris had taken place on the 14th of July 1789. The French too would adopt from the Americans the symbolic Tree of Liberty, and thousands were planted across the country. The French Revolution was viewed with great concern by the British state. The revolutionaries were portrayed as barbaric rebels and condemned for their acts of violence and brutality. However, Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man was widely read by the populace north of the Channel and attracted much support, kindling a reform movement in Great Britain. The British elite were rightly fearful of a similar uprising at home. The ideals of the revolution had captured the minds of a portion of the populace, and a number of societies advocating universal suffrage were established. Reformist Whigs in England founded the Society of the Friends of the People in 1792, which sought parliamentary reform in the United Kingdom, although distinctly more moderate than the revolutionaries in France. An allied Scottish society established themselves and drew members from all ranks and files. One of the leading members of the Scottish Society was Thomas Muir, a Glasgow-born lawyer eventually found guilty of sedition in one of the most infamous trials in Scottish legal history, sentenced to 14 years' transportation to the colonies. He declared in his trial, in which he defended himself, "I have devoted myself to the cause of the people. It is a good cause. It shall ultimately prevail. It shall finally triumph." The political landscape of Scotland at the time was abhorrent to modern ears. Democracy was seen as a dirty word by many, associated with radicalism and anarchy. Only an infinitesimal 0.2% of the population were enfranchised to vote. Only landowners, who were seen as having a vested interest in the land, were given any say in the nation's politics. The boroughs, or towns of Scotland, were virtually enclosed oligarchies, where elections were rarely conducted. The entire nation was effectively ruled by a man monikered the uncrowned King of Scotland, Henry Dundas. Henry Dundas was a lawyer and Tory MP who, over the course of his career, held the positions of Lord Advocate, Keeper of the Signet, Secretary of War, Lord of the Admiralty, Governor of the Bank of Scotland, and was heavily involved in the affairs of the East India Company. Through patronage, Dundas ensured that 3/4 of Scottish MPs were decided in advance by himself, and therefore could rule Scotland remotely from London in the interests of the Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger. However, Thomas Paine's Rights of Man showed the common people the potential and the power of politics if only they could harness it, and the revolutions in America and France demonstrated that real change was possible. Dissenting voices started to be heard. Effigies of Henry Dundas were being systematically burned in Scotland, and symbolic trees of liberty were being planted. The British state responded by banning the works of Thomas Paine and cracking down on what they saw as dangerous radicals, such as Thomas Muir and his associates. This is the backdrop to which the Tree of Liberty was written and circulated, most probably in 1794. Burns was living in Dumfries in the south of Scotland and was, ironically, working for the British Crown as an exciseman, in other words, a taxman, collecting duties on imported goods. He wrote a number of poems at this time that were either overtly political or contained subtler, contemporary political undertones in historical guises, such as A Parcel of Rogues in a Nation, Scots Whahay, and The Slave's Lament. All the while he maintained a position that was superficially loyal to the Crown and State, but the connotations of his writings were clear. His sympathies with the revolutionaries in France could have landed Burns in a lot of trouble. He even faced an inquiry from his superiors in the excise for his political conduct in 1792. This could have cost him his livelihood, or worse, landed him in prison or on board a ship to the colonies. He defended himself against the charge vehemently, and publicly at least was on his best behaviour for a time afterwards. You can therefore see why, if it was written by Burns, the Tree of Liberty was kept anonymous, with its clear allusion to the Liberty Tree by Thomas Paine, whose works were banned, its celebration of revolutionary France, who Britain was now at war with, and its calls for Britain to follow America and France in planting this far-famed tree of liberty. For all the calls for reform in Britain, the old system stayed resolute. It wasn't until the Great Reform Act of 1832 that men who owned property worth £10 or more were given the vote. Further reform acts were passed throughout the 19th century. However, Britain remained less democratic than many other European countries. After World War I and the Representation of the People Act, the electoral franchise was drastically enlarged, with all men over 21 given the vote, and all women over 30, with the stipulation that they owned property or were married to a property owner. In modern times, democracy is no longer seen as a dirty word in political discourse, but rather the reverse. It is, to so many, the holy grail. To be undemocratic is seen as the worst of all evils in politics, and yet the British Constitution is still, to this day, inherently undemocratic. The people are partly represented by the House of Lords, a group of 793 unelected peers, many of whom possess hereditary titles, from barons to earls, from viscounts to marquesses, from dukes to princes. The head of state of the United Kingdom is herself unelected, and the royal family is the epitome of hereditary privilege. It may be easy to become despondent with politics. Many people are disengaged and are either not informed or do not enact their right, indeed their responsibility, to vote in general elections or referendums. To vote, to have a voice, is a privilege which wasn't afforded to many in the past. But just as awestruck readers of Thomas Paine's Rights of Man discovered in 1792, there is a huge potential and power in politics, and it can be harnessed by the people. The first step is to exercise the right to vote. Only then will we see how well the Tree of Liberty can blossom in the 21st century.